I should have kept walking when I heard the crying, but something in the sound made my chest tighten like it already knew I wouldn't. The street was nearly empty, just past midnight, the kind of quiet that hums in your ears when the city finally exhales after a long day. And I remember pulling my jacket tighter as the wind slipped between buildings and brushed cold fingers against my skin, my shoes echoing softly against the damp pavement as I counted the steps to my car parked half a block away, already thinking about sleep, about how my feet hurt and how tomorrow would come too fast. And then I heard it again, a small sound. Uneven, like someone trying not to cry but failing anyway. And I stopped, just for a second, telling myself it wasn't my problem, that someone else would handle it, that I was too tired, too late, too alone. But the sound came again, sharper this time, and before I could talk myself out of it, I was already turning, already stepping toward the narrow alley tucked between a closed bakery and a laundromat with flickering lights, already leaning in just enough to see him, a little boy, maybe 5 or 6, curled near the wall with his knees pulled to his chest, his small hands gripping the fabric of his hoodie like it was the only thing holding him together. And I felt it then, that pull, the one that doesn't ask permission, the one that moves your body before your mind can catch up. So I stepped closer, slow, careful, like approaching a scared animal, and I crouched down a few feet away, lowering myself to his level, my voice softer than I expected as I said, "Hey, it's okay," even though I had no idea if it was, even though nothing about that moment felt okay. And he looked up at me with wide eyes, glassy and red, his cheeks streaked with tears that hadn't quite dried, and for a second he just stared, like he was deciding whether I was safe, whether I was another reason to be afraid. And then his lip trembled and he whispered something I barely caught, something about his mom, something about people who shouldn't be here. And I didn't think, I just moved a little closer, enough to place myself between him and the open end of the alley, like my body alone could shield him from whatever had put that fear in his voice. And I told him, "You're okay. I'm right here." Even though my heart had started to beat faster, even though every instinct in me was starting to whisper that this wasn't just a lost kid, that this was something bigger, something I didn't understand yet. But I stayed. I reached out slowly, letting him decide. And when his small fingers finally wrapped around mine, tight and desperate, I knew. There was no walking away anymore. Not now, not after that. Because whatever he had run from, whatever had left him shaking in the dark, it hadn't followed him here yet. And as long as I was standing, I wasn't going to let it find him again, not even if I had no idea what I was standing against. His fingers tightened around mine like I was the last solid thing in a world that had suddenly stopped making sense, and I felt it in the way his grip trembled, not from cold, but from something deeper, something that does not fade when the temperature rises. And I swallowed the unease climbing up my throat as I glanced toward the mouth of the alley, half expecting someone to appear, half hoping no one would, because I did not know which outcome would be worse. And I leaned closer, lowering my voice again, slower this time, steadier, the way you talk to someone when you are trying to borrow calm you do not fully have. "Hey, look at me. Okay, you are safe right now." And his eyes flickered back to mine, searching, like he was trying to decide if those words meant anything, like he had heard promises before that did not hold. And I could not blame him for that, so I did not repeat it. I just stayed there, present, letting the silence stretch just enough to feel real, until he nodded. Once, small and uncertain, and that was enough for me to keep going. "What is your name?" I asked, brushing a strand of damp hair away from his forehead without thinking, and he hesitated before whispering, "Liam." So quiet I almost missed it, and I nodded like it was the most important thing I had heard all night. "Okay, Liam, I am Emily," and saying my own name out loud grounded me a little, reminded me that I was still just a person in an alley, not someone who knew what to do next, and yet I heard myself asking anyway. "Can you tell me where your mom is?" And that was when his grip tightened again, sharper this time, and his eyes darted past me toward the street, and I felt it before I saw anything, that shift in the air, that subtle change that makes your body go still without asking why, like the night itself had taken a breath and was waiting to see what would happen next. And I turned slightly, just enough to follow his gaze. And at first there was nothing, just the empty sidewalk, the distant hum of a passing car somewhere blocks away, the flicker of a streetlight that had seen better days. But then there were footsteps, slow, measured, not rushed, not hesitant, the kind of steps that do not need to hurry because they already know where they are going, and my pulse picked up, a quiet drum in my ears as I shifted my position instinctively, placing myself more firmly between Liam and the entrance, my hand still wrapped around his, my shoulders straightening even though every part of me knew I was not built for whatever was coming, and the footsteps stopped just outside the alley, close enough now that I could feel the presence without fully seeing it, like a shadow that had not decided whether to step into the light, and for a moment nothing happened, no voice, no movement, just that silence again, heavier. This time, pressing in from all sides, and I realized I was holding my breath, waiting, bracing for something I could not name, and then Liam's fingers tightened again, almost painfully, and he whispered, barely audible, "Do not let them take me." And something in the way he said it, not loud, not dramatic, just certain, made the decision for me before fear could argue, because whatever those footsteps belonged to, whatever was standing just beyond the edge of that alley, I was not stepping aside. Not now, not when a child was looking at me like I was his only chance, and I lifted my chin slightly, my voice steadier than I felt as I said into the darkness, "He is not going anywhere," even though I had no idea who I was speaking to, and for the first time that night, the silence answered back, not with words, but with a presence that shifted, closer now, enough that I could finally feel it right behind me, and somehow, without turning around, I knew everything had just changed. I did not turn around, not right away, because something in me understood that the moment I did, there would be no going back to the version of the night where I could still pretend this was simple, but I could feel him there, not just hear, not just guess, feel, like the air itself had shifted to make space for someone who did not ask for permission to exist in it, and Liam's grip changed again, not fear this time, something else, something steadier, and that confused me more than anything. Because children do not calm down when danger gets closer. They react, they cry harder, they pull away. But he did not. He held on and leaned slightly toward me, as if I was still his shield, and yet his breathing slowed, just enough that I noticed, just enough that it did not match the panic from seconds before, and that was when the voice came, low, controlled, close enough that it brushed the back of my thoughts before it reached my ears. "You should not be here." And it was not a threat. Not loud, not rushed, just a statement, the kind that sounds like a fact that does not need arguing, and every instinct I had told me to step aside, to let whoever this was take control of the situation, to remove myself from something I did not understand. But Liam's fingers tightened again, and I remembered the way he had said, "Do not let them take me," and something stubborn settled in my chest, quiet but unmovable. So I shook my head slightly, even though he could not see it, my voice coming out steadier than I expected. "He stays with me." And there was a pause after that, not long, but long enough that I felt the weight of it, like the world was waiting to see how he would respond. And then the footsteps moved, just one step closer, enough that I could sense the exact distance between us now, maybe 3 feet, maybe less, and I finally turned, slowly. Because anything faster felt like it would break whatever fragile line we were standing on, and when I did, I saw him, tall, still, dressed in dark clothes that seemed too precise for this part of the city at this hour, his posture straight without effort, his presence quiet but undeniable, like everything around him adjusted without being told. And it was not his appearance that held me there, not the sharp lines of his face or the way his eyes seemed to take in everything at once. It was the way the space behind him shifted, the way 2 other figures stood just far enough back to blend into the shadows, watching, waiting, not moving unless he did, and I felt it then, that realization that comes not as a thought, but as a certainty, that this man did not belong to the night in the same way I did, that he was not passing through it, he owned it, or something close enough that the difference did not matter, and still I did not move, because Liam had not let go, because whatever this was, I had already stepped into it the moment I chose to stay, and the man's gaze shifted from me to the boy, not quick, not emotional, just deliberate, and for the first time his expression changed, not softer, not exactly, but something in it eased, like a tension that had been held too long had finally found a place to rest, and Liam moved then, just a fraction, enough that I felt the shift before I saw it, his body leaning slightly out from behind me, his voice small, but clear when he said, "Dad," and everything inside me went still, not dramatic, Not loud, just a quiet, absolute stillness as the pieces rearranged themselves in my mind, as the fear I had been holding twisted into something else entirely. Because I had not been standing between a child and danger, I had been standing between a child and the man everyone else was afraid of, and somehow, I had chosen the wrong side without even knowing there was a choice to make. The word hung in the air longer than it should have, soft and simple, and completely out of place in a moment that felt anything but, and I felt Liam shift beside me, not hiding anymore, not clinging in the same desperate way, but still holding my hand like he had not decided to let go yet. And I looked from him back to the man in front of me, trying to reconcile what I had just heard with what I was seeing, because nothing about him looked like someone a child would run to for comfort, not at first glance, not with that stillness, that control, that quiet intensity that made the space feel smaller without him moving an inch. And yet Liam had said it without hesitation, without doubt, and that kind of certainty does not come from fear, it comes from recognition, from trust, even if I did not understand why. And the man's gaze lingered on the boy for a moment longer before returning to me. And this time there was something different in it, not softer exactly, but focused in a way that felt more personal, like I was no longer just an interruption in his path. And I realized then that I was still standing between them, still holding Liam's hand, still acting like a barrier that no longer made sense, and yet I did not move, not immediately, because stepping aside now felt like admitting I had been wrong, and something stubborn in me resisted that, even as logic told me I should let go, that I was out of my depth in a way that could not be fixed by good intentions, and he seemed to read that hesitation without effort, because his expression shifted just enough to acknowledge it, and when he spoke again, his voice was quieter, but no less steady. You can let go. And it was not a command, not quite, but it carried weight, the kind that comes from being used to being obeyed without needing to raise volume or repeat yourself. And I glanced down at Liam, expecting him to pull away now that his father was here. But he did not. He held on, his small fingers tightening again like he was anchoring himself to something familiar, something he had chosen, and I felt that tug in my chest again, that unexpected connection that had formed too quickly to make sense, and I looked back up, meeting the man's eyes fully this time, and for a second neither of us spoke, the silence stretching between us, not empty but filled with unspoken questions, and I heard myself say, before I could stop it, he was alone. Like that explained everything. Like that justified why I was still here, why I had not walked away, why I was now standing in front of someone who clearly did not need my help, and his gaze did not waver, did not dismiss me, did not thank me either. It simply held, measuring, assessing, and then he nodded once. A small motion that somehow carried more acknowledgement than words would have, and that was when Liam finally moved, stepping slightly toward him, but still keeping one hand wrapped around mine, splitting the space between us like he was not ready to choose one over the other. And something about that made the man's expression shift again, barely noticeable, but enough that I caught it, a crack in the control, a flicker of something human beneath the surface, and it changed the way I saw him, just enough to make me hesitate before pulling my hand away, because now it did not feel like I was handing Liam over to a stranger. It felt like I was stepping out of a moment that had somehow become more complicated than it had any right to be. And as I finally loosened my grip, slowly, giving Liam the chance to hold on as long as he needed, I realized that the fear I had felt before had not disappeared. It had just changed shape, because now I was not afraid of losing the child. I was afraid of what it meant to have been seen by the man standing in front of me, to have stepped into his world without knowing it, and to have no clear way of stepping back out again. Liam did not fully let go, even when his small steps carried him closer to his father, and I noticed the way his fingers lingered at the edge of mine before finally slipping free, like he was memorizing the feeling just in case he needed it again, and that small hesitation stayed with me longer than it should have, longer than made sense for a moment that technically should have been over, because he was no longer alone, because the man standing in front of us clearly had the power to make sure of that, and yet something about the way Liam stayed close but not entirely at ease told me this was not a simple reunion, not the kind where everything immediately falls back into place, and I straightened slowly, brushing my hands against my jacket as if that could reset the situation, as if I could step back into being just another person walking home after a long shift. But the illusion did not hold, not with those eyes still on me, not with the quiet presence behind him that had not moved, had not spoken, but had not disappeared either. And I became aware of how exposed the alley suddenly felt, how narrow, how easy it would be for someone like him to control every exit without needing to say a word. And the thought should have scared me more than it did, but instead it sharpened something inside me, something that refused to shrink just because the situation had shifted, and I met his gaze again, not challenging, not submissive, just steady, because I did not know what else to be. And for a second, I wondered if he would ask me to leave, if he would dismiss me. Now that Liam was no longer alone, if this would end with a quiet thank you or nothing at all. But he did not speak, not immediately, and that silence stretched again, deliberate, almost like he was deciding something that involved me, whether I liked it or not. And I felt that awareness settle into my chest, heavy and unexpected, and then Liam moved again, closer to him this time, his small hand finding the edge of his father's coat, not quite holding on the same way he had held on to me, but not stepping away either. And the man looked down at him briefly, his posture shifting just enough to acknowledge it, just enough to show that this mattered in a way he did not need to explain. And when he looked back at me, there was a new layer in his expression, something measured, something that suggested the moment had not ended but changed direction. And I heard him say, calm and precise, "You came into something you do not understand." And it was not an accusation, not exactly, but it carried weight, the kind that made it clear he was stating a fact, not inviting a discussion. And I felt my jaw tighten slightly, not in defiance but in recognition, because he was right. I had stepped into something without knowing the rules, without knowing the consequences, and I should have felt regret, should have wished I had kept walking when I first heard the crying. But I did not. Not when I looked at Liam. Not when I remembered the way he had been curled against that wall, alone and afraid. And I answered before I could overthink it, my voice quiet but firm. He needed someone. And the words hung there, simple and insufficient against the weight of everything else in that alley. But I did not take them back. And for a moment nothing happened, no immediate response, no dismissal, just that same steady gaze holding mine. And then, almost imperceptibly, he nodded again, smaller this time, like he had already made a decision, and this was just the acknowledgement of it. And I felt something shift in the air, not danger, not relief, something in between, something that felt like the beginning of a line being drawn that I had already crossed, without realizing it. And I understood then, without him having to say it, that walking away would not be as simple as turning around, because whatever this was, whatever world he belonged to, it had already noticed me, and it was not going to forget. The moment stretched just long enough for me to realize I was waiting for his permission to leave, and that realization unsettled me more than anything else that had happened so far, because I had never been the kind of person who needed approval to walk away from a situation, and yet here I was, standing in a dim alley past midnight, silently measuring my next move against a man I had met less than 5 minutes ago. And somehow it felt like the wrong decision could follow me long after I stepped out of sight, and I shifted my weight slightly, glancing toward the street again as if reminding myself that there was still a world outside of this moment, still cars passing, still people finishing their nights without knowing any of this existed. And I took a breath, steadying myself, because I refused to let the quiet pressure of his presence dictate what I did next, and I said, carefully, I should go, keeping my voice even. Not asking, not apologizing, just stating it the way I had learned to do when I needed to reclaim control of a situation. And for a second nothing changed, no immediate reaction, no step forward or backward, just that same stillness that made everything feel deliberate. And then his gaze shifted slightly, not away from me, but past me, toward the open street, like he was assessing something I could not see. And I felt it again, that subtle shift in the air, the kind that does not come from noise but from awareness. And before I could ask, or even fully process it, one of the men behind him moved, just a step, quiet but precise, positioning himself closer to the alley entrance without blocking it completely. And I understood then that this was not random, that every movement here had intention, had purpose, and that whatever he was paying attention to, it mattered. And I felt a flicker of unease crawl up my spine, not sharp enough to be panic, but enough to make me stay where I was instead of walking away like I had planned. And I glanced down at Liam, who had gone still again, his small hand now gripping the edge of his father's coat more tightly, his eyes fixed on the same direction his father had looked, and that was enough to keep me rooted, because whatever this was, it was not over, not yet, and I found myself stepping slightly closer without meaning to, not back behind Liam, not fully retreating, just enough that I was no longer halfway turned toward the exit, and I hated that my body had made that decision before my mind did, but I did not correct it. And then the man finally spoke again, quieter this time, almost like the words were meant for me alone, even though they carried through the narrow space. You do not leave yet. And it should have sounded like a command, should have triggered that instinct to push back, to question, to refuse, but it did not land that way, not exactly, because there was something else underneath it, something that felt less like control and more like certainty, like he already knew I was not going anywhere, and I realized with a sharp clarity that he was not trying to stop me. He was informing me of what was already true, and that unsettled me more than if he had ordered me to stay, because it meant he had read the situation, read me, read the moment, and come to the same conclusion I had not fully admitted to myself yet. And I swallowed, my voice quieter when I answered. Why? Not because I expected a full explanation, but because I needed to hear something. Anything that made this feel less like I was standing in the middle of a story I did not understand. And his gaze returned to mine, steady, unhurried, and for the first time there was a hint of something else there. Not emotion, not exactly, but awareness, like he recognized the question for what it was. And when he spoke, the answer was simple, almost too simple for the weight it carried. Because you are already involved. And the words settled into me slowly, not dramatic, not loud, but final in a way that left no room for argument. And I realized then that he was right. Not because of him, not because of whatever world he belonged to, but because of the choice I had made minutes ago when I stepped into that alley and reached for a crying child. Because some decisions do not end when the immediate danger passes, some decisions follow you, reshape what comes next, and standing there, with Liam pressed close to his father and the night holding its breath around us, I understood that walking away would not undo anything. And for the first time since I heard that cry, I stopped thinking about leaving and started wondering what staying was going to cost. The words stayed with me longer than anything else he had said, not because they were dramatic, but because they settled into something I could not ignore, something that felt uncomfortably true. And I found myself standing there without a clear next step, without the usual instinct to move forward or pull back, just suspended in a moment that refused to resolve itself. And I became aware of every small detail around me. The faint hum of electricity from the streetlight, the distant sound of a car turning a corner somewhere out of sight, the quiet rhythm of Liam's breathing as he stayed close to his father, and beneath all of that, the steady presence of the man in front of me, unchanged, unmoved, like he had already accounted for every possible outcome and found none of them urgent. And that calm should have reassured me, should have signaled control, safety even, but instead it made everything feel more deliberate, more calculated, and I realized I was trying to read him the way he seemed to read everything else, searching for something human, something predictable, something I could hold on to. And for a moment I thought I saw it, not in his posture, not in his expression, but in the way his hand moved, subtle, almost absent-minded, resting briefly on Liam's shoulder, not gripping, not guiding, just there, and the boy leaned into it without hesitation, like it was something familiar, something trusted, and that small interaction shifted something in me, because it did not match the image I had built in my head seconds ago. It did not fit with the quiet authority, the controlled distance, and it made me hesitate in a different way, not out of fear, but out of uncertainty, and I heard myself ask, before I could stop it, is he safe now? And the question came out softer than I intended, less guarded, more honest, and for the first time his gaze held mine without that layer of assessment, without the same calculated distance, and he answered without pause. He is simple, direct, final, and I believed him, not because I understood why, not because I trusted him completely, but because there was no hesitation in it, no performance, just certainty. And that certainty did something unexpected. It eased the tightness that had been sitting in my chest since I first heard Liam cry, and I exhaled slowly, not realizing I had been holding that tension until it began to release, and I nodded, more to myself than to him, as if confirming that part of this night had reached its conclusion, that at least one thing had been resolved, and yet I did not move, did not step back, did not turn toward the street the way I had planned before. Because something else had taken its place, something quieter but just as persistent, a question that had not been asked out loud, and I realized I was still looking at him, still waiting, not for permission this time, but for understanding, and he seemed to recognize that, because his expression shifted again, just slightly, enough to acknowledge that the moment between us had not ended, that there was still something unresolved, and he said, almost as if finishing a thought I had not spoken, "But you are not." And the words landed differently than everything else, not as a warning, not as a threat, but as a statement of fact that I had not fully considered, and I felt that unease return, sharper this time, because it turned the focus back on me, on my place in this situation, on the choice I had made without knowing the consequences, and I opened my mouth to respond, to ask what he meant, to push back against the implication, but before I could, one of the men near the entrance shifted again, more noticeable this time, his attention fixed on something beyond the alley, and the man in front of me did not look away, did not turn, but I could feel the change, subtle but immediate, like the air itself had tightened, and Liam pressed closer to his side, his small hand gripping the fabric of his coat again, and I understood then that whatever this was, whatever had started before I stepped into that alley, it was not finished yet, and somehow, without anyone saying it out loud, I knew that his words had not been a suggestion, they had been a reality I was only just beginning to see. Because being safe was not about standing next to the right person, it was about whether you had stepped into something that would follow you long after the moment ended. And standing there, with the night closing in around us, I realized I had done exactly that. The shift was almost invisible, but I felt it before I understood it. The way the air changed from still to aware, like something unseen had just crossed an invisible line, and my body reacted before my mind could catch up, my shoulders tightening, my breath slowing, my attention pulling toward the alley entrance without fully turning my head, because whatever had caught their attention was not meant for me to see first, and that realization alone was enough to keep me still, and I watched the man in front of me instead, because he did not move, did not glance away, did not acknowledge the change the way anyone else would have, and that told me everything I needed to know, that whatever was happening, he had expected it, had already accounted for it, and somehow that made it worse, because it meant I was standing in the middle of something that had started long before I arrived, something that did not care that I had only stepped into it minutes ago. And Liam pressed closer to him again, his small frame half hidden against his side, and this time there was no confusion in his reaction, no hesitation, just instinct, like he had felt this shift before and knew what it meant even if he could not explain it. And I found myself taking a small step back, not running, not retreating completely, just enough to create space, enough to remind myself that I was not part of whatever this was. And yet, even as I did it, I knew it was not true, not anymore. And the thoughts settled into me with a quiet weight, and I swallowed, my voice lower when I said, "What is going on?" Not demanding, not panicked, just needing something to hold on to, something that made sense. And for a moment he did not answer, his gaze still on me, still steady, like the question itself was secondary to something else. And then he finally spoke, calm and precise. "You should not have been seen." And the words did not register at first, not fully, because they were not what I expected, not an explanation, not reassurance, but something else. Entirely, something that implied a line had already been crossed, and I felt that unease sharpen again, because I did not know who had seen me, or why it mattered, but the fact that it did told me more than I wanted to understand, and I opened my mouth to ask more, to push for clarity, but before I could, there was movement near the entrance again, subtle but undeniable, and one of the men stepped slightly forward, not blocking, not reacting aggressively, just adjusting, like a piece on a board, shifting into place, and I realized then that this was not chaos, not unpredictability, it was control, measured and intentional, and I was the only variable that had not been planned for, and that thought settled into my chest in a way that made everything feel sharper, more immediate, and I looked back at him, really looked this time, trying to understand how someone could stand this still in a moment like this, how someone could carry this kind of presence without effort. And for the first time I noticed something else, something beneath the control, not weakness, not hesitation, but focus, the kind that narrows the world down to only what matters. And right now, somehow, that included me, and I felt it in the way his attention did not leave mine even as everything else shifted around us. And then he spoke again, quieter, almost like he was finishing a thought I had not fully heard. Which means you stay with us? And this time it was not a suggestion, not an observation. It was a decision, already made, already set in motion, and I felt the weight of it settle into me, heavy and undeniable. Because there was no space in his tone for refusal, not because he would force it, but because he did not expect it, and that expectation, that certainty, made something in me go still, not out of fear, but out of realization, because I understood then that this was no longer about a moment in an alley, no longer about helping a child and walking away. It had shifted into something else entirely, something that extended beyond this night, beyond this place. And as I stood there, the city still moving somewhere beyond the narrow walls around us, I realized that staying was not a choice I was being asked to make. It was the consequence of the one I had already made when I decided not to walk away. I felt the finality of his words settle in before anything else had a chance to move, before the men at the entrance adjusted again, before Liam shifted beside him, before I could even form a response that sounded like my own. And it was not loud or dramatic. It did not crash into me the way fear sometimes does. It arrived quietly, like something inevitable that had been building long before I noticed it. And I realized then that this moment was not asking for my agreement. It was marking a point of no return, and I stood there, still, aware of the way my heartbeat had slowed instead of racing, aware of the strange clarity that had taken its place. Because panic would have been easier. Panic would have given me something to react to, something to push against. But this was different. This was understanding, and I hated how quickly it came, how naturally it fit into the space he had already defined. And I glanced past him for just a second, toward the street that felt farther away now than it had minutes ago, the same sidewalk, the same flickering light, the same quiet city moving on without noticing anything that had just changed for me. And I could walk there. I could try. I could pretend this did not concern me. But I knew, with a certainty that mirrored his own, that it would not matter, because whatever had seen me, whatever had marked this moment, it would not stay in this alley. It would follow, it would linger, it would turn a simple walk home into something else entirely. And that truth settled deeper than anything he could have said. And I looked back at him, really looked this time, not searching for answers, not questioning, just seeing, and I understood something I had not allowed myself to before, that he was not the danger I had stepped into. He was the one who had already survived it, the one who moved through it with that same controlled stillness because he had learned how to. And that realization shifted something inside me. Not trust, not yet, but recognition. And Liam moved again, his small hand tightening against his father's coat as he looked up at him, not speaking, just waiting, and the man's hand returned to his shoulder, steady, grounding, and for a brief second the world narrowed to that simple contact, that quiet reassurance that did not need to be explained. And then his attention returned to me, and this time there was no distance left in it. No room for misinterpretation, just a clear, deliberate focus that made everything else feel secondary. And he said, not louder, not harsher, but final in a way that settled into the air itself. You chose to stand in front of him. And I felt that truth land in my chest, because it was not a question, not an accusation. It was a statement of fact that I could not deny. And he continued, just enough to close the space between what had happened and what would come next. Now you stand with us. And there it was, the line drawn not by force but by consequence, not by demand, but by the simple reality of what I had already done. And I realized then that this was the part no one talks about. Not the moment of bravery, not the decision to help, but what follows after. The way a single choice can pull you into something larger than yourself, something that does not end when the immediate danger passes. And I took a slow breath, not to calm myself, but to accept it, because there was no point pretending otherwise. And for the first time since I heard Liam cry, I did not think about leaving. I did not look toward the street. I did not search for an exit. I stayed where I was, meeting his gaze with a steadiness that felt unfamiliar but necessary. And in that quiet, in that narrow space between what I had been and what I was stepping into, I understood something with absolute clarity. That some nights do not end when the clock moves forward. Some nights redraw the line of your life. And I had already crossed it the moment I chose not to walk away.